Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anupama, Professor at Department of Economics, Punjab University, Patiala. I am going to talk about the module Urban Livelihood Strategies and Economic Restructuring from Population, Urbanization and Poverty. So students, we are going to discuss about the risks and vulnerabilities that arise due to urbanization as well as economic restructuring. We will also discuss about the livelihood strategies of urban citizens during the process of economic restructuring. This module aims to throw light on economic restructuring, the livelihood strategies, economic restructuring in urban areas, the growth of services, changes in sectoral share in GDP, trends in traditional sectors' share in output and employment, growth of informal sector, quality of jobs in informal sector, and the risks and vulnerabilities in the informal sector. In 2011, the world population reached the 7 billion mark. This historic milestone was passed only 12 years after crossing the 6 billion mark, the shortest recorded time to add 1 billion people to the world population. At the same time, the absolute additions to the number of urban dwellers in the world are at all-time high, at almost 74 million people per year. The urban proportion of the world population passed the 50% mark in 2007, and the United Nations projections point to a further deepening of the urbanization process in the coming decades. Urbanization is proceeding fastest in developing countries, especially in Africa, which is still the least urbanized but one of the most rapidly urbanizing continents along with Asia, and the regional balance of urbanization has increasingly tipped towards the less developed regions of the world. While in the 1950s, the majority of the urban dwellers in the world resided in the developed nations, today, close to 3/4 of all urban residents in the world live in developing countries. Moreover, of the nearly 73 million new urban dwellers that will be added to the world's urban population every day between 2014 and 2020, 67 million, that is 92%, will reside in cities and towns of the developing countries. Between 2007 and 2025, the annual urban population increase in developing regions is expected to be 53 million or 2.27% compared to a mere 3 million or 0.49% in the developed regions. From a demographic point of view, urbanization is the process by which towns and cities are formed and increase in size, and by which an increasing number of proportion of people live and work in settlements defined as urban. From economic point of view, the urban settlements are more characterized by non-agricultural activities with market for manufactured goods and services. However, in developing region, we can easily find a positive association of the growth of urban sector with growth of the informal sector. More rapid growth of urban sector leads to faster additions to informal labor force. On the other hand, long-term sustained growth is linked with growth of the formal sector. The informal sector is characterized by more insecurities, lower income and increased vulnerabilities, and during any economic restructuring, not only the risks and shocks increase for the informal sector, but the workers in the formal sector may also be forced to join the informal sector, further aggravating the risks and vulnerabilities of the urban economies. Therefore, it is important here to understand the livelihood strategies in urban areas during economic restructuring. In this respect, first of all, let us understand the concept of economic restructuring and the livelihood strategies. Economic restructuring. Economic restructuring refers to the phenomena of urban areas shifting from a manufacturing to service sector economic base. This transformation has a great impact upon the distribution of newly created employment opportunities and income upon individuals or communities with different human capabilities. This in turn would also transform the livelihood strategies of urban populations. Livelihood strategies. The livelihood strategies are the combination of activities that people choose to undertake in order to achieve their livelihood goals. The choice of strategies is a dynamic process in which people combine activities to meet their changing needs subject to their assets and vulnerabilities and shocks which mutually influence each other. The main assets which would determine the coping strategies of individuals or households to any economic restructuring or say shocks and vulnerabilities will be discussed as follows. First of all, in this respect, we will discuss about the human resources. Human resources are the capabilities, skills, experience, labor, knowledge, creativity, and health, etc. These are important to the fulfillment of productive and reproductive tasks. Capacity to work is the main asset of the urban poor. Lack of skills and education affects the ability to secure a livelihood in towns more directly than it does in the rural areas. The natural resources include land, water, pastures, etc. Natural assets may be less significant in an urban setting, but with increasing reliance on agriculture, both rural and urban areas, access to land, security of tenure, and function is largely an important asset to urban dwellers directly or indirectly. The physical resources include basic infrastructure and services, that is shelter, transport, water, energy, communications, hospitals, and many things more. This also includes equipments, tools, inputs, food stocks, household assets, livestock, etc. Land in urban areas can as well be categorized as a physical asset that enables households to access shelter, has locational attributes that provide access to their livelihood possibilities, and has investment potential. The financial resources cover savings, loans, credit, wages, salaries, pensions, and remittances. Urban households are highly monetized, and so access to a monetary income is essential for survival. The social resources include formal and informal networks from various opportunities and benefits can be drawn by people in their pursuit of livelihoods. These are mainly reciprocity and trust embedded in social relations, social structures, and societal institutional arrangements. Closely linked to social resources are political resources based on access to the political process and decision making. The urban poor are linked into structures of governance through their dependence on or exclusion from the delivery of infrastructure and services by municipal authorities. According to the livelihood framework or approach, a household's livelihood strategy and so its level of well-being depends on the assets or resources it has access to under given economic conditions. Every group, household, and individual has a stock of assets at its disposal to achieve a sustainable livelihood. This stock of assets can be stored, accumulated, exchanged, or depleted and put to work to generate a flow of income or other benefits. In that case, the strategies adopted by household aim to cope with and recover from stresses and shocks, to maintain or improve capability or assets, and to offer sustainable livelihood opportunities. In short, it can be stated that if the outcomes of the livelihood strategies adopted by the poor people are to be positive, they should improve incomes, increase well-being, reduce vulnerability, improve food security, and make more sustainable use of natural resources. In recent decades, neoliberal globalization has accompanied the implementation of economic reforms such as privatization of production, lowered state intervention, and trade liberalization. That these global and national processes intersect with economic strategies at the household and individual scales in ways that affects basic livelihoods is well documented. Livelihood strategies from the developing economies importantly encompass aspects of social and economic processes at both the micro and the macro scales. While the macro scale analyze focus on the various assets or resources available to households and the multiple activities they undertake, these livelihood portfolios are responses to the macro scale through state policy and economic restructuring that affect provision of services and resources, markets, employment, and producer prices. The extent to which households and individuals of different social groups with the urban population are able to overcome, cope with, and manipulate macro scale processes resulting in their economic vulnerability affects the viability of the livelihood strategies. Thus, it is important to look at the macro level changes as well as the individual responses in the economies fastly undergoing economic change. Worldwide, economic restructuring and the growing interdependence of the countries and regions around the world has also led to emergence of a new urban hierarchy. Globalization clearly has had a very uneven impact on various parts of the world. While the restructuring of global production has brought numerous benefits to some countries, previously thriving manufacturing cities in industrially advanced economies have lost many factory jobs and have been forced to restructure their economy. The region that has benefited the most from globalization is Asia, while large parts of Africa have effectively been bypassed. Many cities in Pacific Asia have experienced dramatic economic growth, reflecting the fact that the region is completely integrated into a new global economy. Cities on the forefront of global restructuring, such as Hong Kong, Singapore, Seoul, and Taipei, have enjoyed unprecedented growth rates during the last 2 decades. All now rank among the top trading cities in the world, and in fact, the level of GNP per capita in Hong Kong and Singapore exceeds that of many European countries. The experience of rapid urban transformation is now being repeated in the newly industrialized economies of Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Cities such as Jakarta and Bangkok are booming even though Indonesia would still be classified as a low-income country according to the World Bank criteria, while Malaysia, Thailand, and Philippines would be considered the middle-income countries. While we are in a rapidly urbanizing world in which economies of the megacities have captured much public attention, most of the new growth will occur in smaller towns and cities, which have fewer resources to respond to the magnitude of the change. In such cities, the livelihoods of the residents have responded differently to economic restructuring. In some, the economic restructuring not only has led to shift towards the service sector, but has towards informal employment. Whereas the employment in service sector requires attainment of higher levels of human capital assets, the employment in the informal sector seems to be a coping strategy for most of the households, with fewer assets during the phases of economic restructuring of the economy in general and that of the city in particular. On the positive side, the cities are considered to be major drivers of economic growth. In fact, urban gross domestic product represents about 80% of world GDP. Cities have been pivotal centers for economic growth, employment creation, innovation, and cultural exchange. Now let us focus upon economic restructuring in urban areas. Broadly, the economic restructuring of urban areas with their impact on livelihoods can be discussed through various aspects. First among these is that the services are becoming a major source of economic growth. Urbanization leads to growth of services both on the demand and supply side. On the demand side, rising urbanization is associated with higher income, which in turn raises the demand for a wide array of services. Thus, both traditional and modern services thrive in urban locations. On the supply side, since the service sector industries often cater to varying business activities, so they will locate in areas with dense and diverse business settings. On the whole, the economic expansion has a circular effect of expansion of services as well as the manufacturing sector. And since after reaching a point, the growth of the manufacturing sector slows down, the growth of services abounds. The share of service sector in both the GDP and employment is ought to increase. This can be observed from figure 1 and figure 2. Figure 1 and 2 have shown the change in share of service sector in GDP as well as employment since 1980. That is the period when most of the economies entered the phase of economic restructuring, both due to internal forces of growth as well as the external factors, that is the global economic changes. We can see from these figures that the share of service sector has been increasing both in GDP as well as employment consistently since 1980. However, the rise in share of service sector in employment is slower than its share in GDP. This points towards the fact that the service sector has declining employment elasticity to GDP. Yet, growth of income has been mainly concentrated in services. For a clear picture, we can observe the share of each sector in GDP between 1980 and 2010 and GDP growth between 1990s and 2000s. For this, we can see figure 3. This figure clearly indicates that for most of the economies, not only the share of services has increased in GDP between 1980 and 2010, we can also observe that its contribution to GDP growth has also been higher than that of the industry and agriculture, with a few exceptions. Thus, this is beyond doubt that the service sector has established itself as a major source of growth during the economic restructuring of the countries. The second important aspect is that the traditional industries are losing ground. The traditional industries in the cities are losing their importance gradually. This is mainly due to increased competition from both the large-scale native industries and the penetration of global players in the markets of the developing economies. These trends have great impact upon employment, or say the livelihoods of the persons, depending upon non-agricultural activities, a large proportion of whom lives in urban areas. UNIDO, in a study of BRICS countries, has shown that the traditional sectors of manufacturing sector, such as food and beverages, textiles and textile products, wood and wood products, etc., had registered a decline in value addition as well as employment. However, the type of sector and the rate of decline has been different in different industries. The sector of textiles seems to be losing its place almost in every country. On the other hand, the newly emerging sectors are chemicals and chemical products, basic metal products, electrical and optical equipment, and transport equipments, again with varying degree in different countries. The central idea of whole of this discussion is that the economic restructuring of most of the developing countries not only means rising share of the services but also reducing importance of the traditional manufacturing sector. Due to such shifts, the unskilled and less educated workforce, or say the urban poor, would struggle hard to survive. In such scenarios, the labor market could offer them only the low-paid informal jobs. Even for the more skilled, the restructuring also means less interference of the governments. Now, it is important to discuss the impact of economic restructuring upon growth of the informal sector. The recent trends in growth of the urban economies have been mainly based upon capital-intensive manufacturing and high-tech services. Though the average income levels have increased due to increased employment opportunities in these sectors, however, for majority of the unskilled workers in the developing countries who shift to urban areas, such sectors offer a little hope, as in many instances, labor market conditions and the quality of employment growth have not improved to the same degree and in the urban areas of the majority of developing economies. New job creation has mainly taken place in the informal economy, where around 60% of workers find income opportunities. However, the informal economy is characterized by less job security, lower incomes, and an absence of access to a range of social benefits, which means the absence of key ingredients of decent work opportunities. The proportion of informal workers in a few developing countries can be observed from figure 4. The figure shows that as compared to early 90s, the informality has increased in Latin America, remained almost the same in Asia, and declined in Africa. Though the pattern of change may not suggest a definite relationship between the economic restructuring and the proportion of informal workers, but one thing is loud and clear, and that in these economies, more than 50% of the workers are employed in the informal sector. Actually, the structural changes in these economies have shown two contrasting trends. Informality has declined as proportion of the labor force in agriculture declined, while on the other hand, the informality increased in the non-agriculture sector. Therefore, the countries which have witnessed a larger increase in informal employment in the non-agriculture sector as compared to the decline of the same in agriculture sector, the informality has increased. Even within the region, we can find wide variations. For example, in Asian region, the informality is 93% in case of India as compared to about 70% in Indonesia. However, the informal sector is very heterogeneous in composition, in which we can also find high income professionals as well as own account small enterprises apart from the casual workers, regular workers, and the unpaid family workers. In each of these segments, the vulnerability to poverty and levels of earnings are different. To understand this, we can look at Chen's framework of segmented informal labor market shown in figure 5. The figure shows that out of the informal workers, a big majority is unpaid family workers, home workers, and informal casual workers, while a very few of them are employers and regular wage workers. If we go down to this pyramid, where vast majority of informal workers are found, we can find that average earnings are lower and the risk to poverty is high, while opposite is the case for those lying in the upper segments of this pyramidal structure of informal employment. Thus, if most of the urban workers during the economic restructuring found themselves to be placed in the lower rungs of this pyramid for earning their livelihoods due to lower attainments of the assets in general, their risks and vulnerabilities would definitely be very high. This is the reason of inability or failure of urban poor to pull themselves out of the poverty through employment. A study by Vigo on 11 cities from 10 developing countries has shown that more than 70% of the workers in the cities are self-employed and less than 30% are wage employed or hired workers, out of which the share of regular workers is again very low. Moreover, the income and the wages of the hired workers are very low in the informal sector. In urban areas of most of the developing economies, these are close to the legal minimum. This can be observed from Table 1. The table shows that the income of the small entrepreneurs in urban informal sector is higher than the legal minimum wages, but the margin is not very high. It is hardly 1.7 or 1.8 times of stipulated minimum wages in the countries mentioned in the table. And in case of wages, the conditions are even worse. In Morocco, India, and Turkey, these are just equal to the minimum wages. But in Egypt and Brazil, the workers in the informal sector are not even earning the bare subsistence, as the table shows that their wages are 20% and 40% respectively of the minimum legal wages. However, the data for wages and earnings are not adequately and accurately available just due to the informal character of these activities. But it is being widely recognized that even if the respective governments are able to make the data on this aspect available, the number of darker spots would definitely be more than the bright ones. Low and irregular earnings, along with the absence of any social protection, definitely indicates prevalence of poverty among the informal sector workers. In a study commissioned by OECD, it has been indicated that the two poorest regions of the world, that is Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, a vast majority of the workers are in informal employment, and vast majority of people live in extreme poverty, showing an inevitable overlap between poverty and informal employment. In these countries, the poverty among the informal workers in urban areas is also higher than the national averages. Whole of the informal employment is not bad, and whole of the formal employment is also not decent one. Many times, some workers are in the informal sector by their choice, as they want a flexible, regular jobs with fewer restrictions and regulations. These workers are not placed in the informal sector just due to shocks and vulnerabilities of the urban areas, but by their own choice. Despite these facts, it is still uncontested that in the developing countries, a greater share of poor workers live below the poverty line as compared to the formal sector workers. So students, let us summarize what we have learned in this module. To sum up, it can be stated that with rapid rates of urbanization, as the urban economies restructure themselves, we can see the decay of traditional manufacturing sector and the economy moves to high-tech services, resulting in fewer decent employment opportunities for the unskilled workers who have shifted to urban areas in search of better employment opportunities. As these workers have lower access to all types of capital assets, that is the human capital, financial capital, physical capital, as well as the social capital, they are more vulnerable to the shocks of economic restructuring of the urban areas and therefore are pushed to low-paid, insecure, informal jobs. These jobs, which are characterized by absence of all the qualities of decent work, never enable these workers to pull themselves out of poverty. Therefore, for any policy of inclusive growth of the cities, the government should take due care of the effects of economic restructuring of the cities upon majority of the asset deprived workers, their livelihood strategies and the coping mechanisms. Their interest should be appropriately included in the urban planning and policy. This will require a radical reappraisal of urban planning to ensure the equitable use of urban space, to minimize the segregation between the formal and informal economies, and to support the livelihoods or economic activities of poor households. This will also require that the working poor in the informal economy are organized and have sufficient voice and bargaining power to help shape the development trajectories of the cities in which they live and work. That's all with today's lecture. I hope you must have enjoyed this lecture. Thank you.